Hey guys, Mr. Bostic here. Welcome to part one of our discussion of the classical Greeks from chapter 7. Just so you know, this video is going to cover from the Ionian writers through the pre-Socratic, or as your book calls them, early philosophers. Pre-Socratic just means that they came before Socrates. We'll talk about him later. Right? So let's go ahead and jump on in. Keep in mind that a lot of the chapters you've already noticed deals with particular intellectuals who were famous from one area of or one field of knowledge to another. And so a lot of your work here is going to be just kind of tagging all of these probably unusual names to the area that they were working in, right? The first one we have here is Sappho. Now, also the only woman that we have on the list. And she's famous for inventing lyric poetry. Now, you might be wondering what that is. All right, and you might think lyrics, well, those are the words to songs. Well, that's not a coincidence because a lyre, as you see pictured here beside her, is a handheld harp. And poetry in the ancient world was usually recited to music, right? So songs really are poems. And if you see the song lyrics written out, they generally look like a poem anyhow, right? So Sappho invented lyric poetry, and that's distinguished from epic poetry that we've already been dealing with when we read or talked about Homer, right? So epic poems are long and they're involved tales that to us they look like the length of a novel, and they're usually about grand events and the identity of a people, right? Lyric poetry is almost always about love, right? And it's like most of the typical shorter poems that you might have memorized, for example, for your English class or for a festival day, right? So Sappho invented lyric poetry and was famous throughout the Greek world, the ancient world, for her lyric poetry, right? Here we move to Herodotus. We've talked about him. He came from Halicarnassus. I should have mentioned it. With Sappho, she came from an island that's called Lesbos, and so she's famous. It's famous for her, right? Herodotus, on the other hand, came from Halicarnassus and is the father of history. In fact, he invented the term. Historia originally meant inquiry, and he traveled around personally through huge swaths of the ancient world, asking people about the tales of their origins, and also writing about some events that were current in his own day, such as the Persian Wars. Right. So we we owe quite a lot, especially in our class, to Herodotus. It's kind of the modern fashion for the last few centuries to be dismissive about Herodotus, and we've talked about that before as well. Because if you're traveling around the ancient world and asking people about the earliest origin of their society, you're going to get a lot of tales that are mixed up with legend, much like we've seen with the tale of the Trojan War. And he would often say what he found believable and what he didn't, but he would typically include it all. And for ancient historians, his work is hugely important, even though they tend to like to scorn him. Right? Thucydides, who follows shortly thereafter from Herodotus, is much more respected by modern historians, typically because he only wrote about his own day and in a very critical, investigative, analytical way, very quick to reject things as unreliable, etc. Whereas Herodotus was more of a gatherer, Thucydides was more of a selector, right? And so modern historians tend to like that better. But the fact is, Herodotus' work is hugely important for a lot of what we know about the ancient world. Now, the third guy here did not make it into your study list. Sorry about that, guys. He doesn't have nearly as much in our text either, right? It's Hecataeus, and it's called by some the father of geography. He also wrote genealogies of prominent families, right? And a scholar in that way. You notice his map of the world. It's pretty good when it comes to Eastern Mediterranean, but it gets very distorted as you get away from there, right? And the Greeks talked about ocean as a river circling all the lands, right? It essentially shows their limited knowledge, right, of geography of the day. All right, now let's go ahead and progress here. We have some other Ionian writers who, instead of these pursuits, were really interested in nature. Now, the Greek word for nature is physis, as you see here. And this is where we get our word physics, right? Which gives us a little bit of a hint, because what we're talking about here today, we call it science. But they didn't. They call it natural philosophy. In other words, philosophy about the natural world, right? And that's nature, right? So, well, what does the word philosophy mean? Well, philosophy is a compound word. It's a Greek word, right? Philo means love. Sophia means wisdom. So philosophia means the love of wisdom. Notice that's a little bit broader. It's a little deeper, actually, than science. Science comes from Latin. It means knowledge, right? But wisdom presumes knowledge, but something a little bit deeper than that as well, right? And that's going to come to mean a lot in the modern world. Not our topic for today, but let's go ahead and see what the implication of that is for us. Now, keep in mind, before these particular pre-Socratic philosophers, everyone pretty much assumed that everything was made up of 4 elements. Yes, I'm pretty sure you can probably guess what those 4 elements are: earth, air, fire, and water. But while that's the right idea, that's not this story. All right, so you might ask, why did they get this idea? Where do these cultures come up with the idea that everything's made up of earth, air, fire, and water? Well, if you take fire and you put it to something that will burn, if people from earliest times notice something, right? You get something coming out of that. You get more flames, fire, right? You eventually get ashes, the form of earth. You get smoke billows, and an air. You can see the air moving, and gusting off of the fire. You get air produced, and then at least that's the way they see it. And then steam, vapor, things released. I mean, there's always a little bit of moisture in whatever's being burned, and it's being released by that fire. So in other words, fire is letting the elements separate into their components: fire, earth, air, and water. Fire is really the first technology that mankind had. And so I know you don't think of it as technology. You think of a phone as technology, or the computer you're watching this on. But that's really the first technology. And so it's the first thing that people, get a lot of their observations and presumptions from. Right. But okay, back to the pre-Socratic philosophers. The innovation that they make is to really believe that out of all this, one of those has got to be the most basic. Right? That the 4 are not equally basic, but one would be the most basic. And so this is how that pans out. With Thales, and that's not Thales, it's Thales, he came from Miletus. Notice the first 3 of these guys came from Miletus, which, as we've already seen, is a city on the coast of Ionia. Right? Thales believed that the most foundational element of all was water. Right? Now, a successor to him, and of course, all these philosophers said a lot more than this. But this is one of the kind of key ideas that comes out of their work. Right? Anaximenes believed that the foundational element was air. Anaximander, his student, believed that it was something he called the boundless, which can be a little confusing. But if you kind of think of it as sort of a primordial soup made up of just a swirl of electrons, protons, and neutrons, right? And that you could pull out the right number and make any element you wanted to. That'd be sort of a modern chemistry way of describing what he means by the boundless. Now, of course, they had no knowledge of protons, neutrons, and electrons, right? The closest they get is Democritus here, who comes up with the idea of an atom, right? But their idea of an atom, and frankly anybody's idea of an atom that even believed in such a thing up until the 1800s, they thought of atoms more like hard, indivisible things. They had no idea of atomic particles, portions of an atom, right? But at any rate, Anaximander, broke away from that 4-element idea to something a little bit more, stretching beyond the boundaries of that, right? As did Democritus. Heraclitus, on the other hand, took the position that fire was the most foundational element. Now, you may have noticed there's one of those 4 elements that nobody chose. And you might think, why is that? Why does that make sense, right? I'd suggest it makes sense because it seems to be the least dynamic of all the 4, right? Waves can crash over you or swamp your boat. Water seems pretty powerful, right? Air can gust and blow things apart, right? Storms, tornadoes, hurricanes, right? Fire clearly is powerful. It can burn, whole cities, right? Earth seems much more stable and also much more varied. It looks like, already looks like it has components, right? So I think that's probably why nobody chose Earth. Right. Now, some other pre-Socratic philosophers really branched out from this whole concept entirely. I mean, you have especially Pythagoras, who is famous, of course, for the Pythagorean theorem that we see here, that you would have already been learning in math, right? That, with the right triangle, the a squared plus b squared equals c squared. and you can find the hypotenuse, right? But he really did a lot more than that, right? He had a foundational idea of harmony and a mathematical understanding of what that means. But as it applies to music, as it applies to astronomy, he believed that there was actually a kind of harmony of the heavens, the heavenly spheres, the kind of music of the heavenly spheres that we just simply couldn't hear. And he came up with a lot of a very kind of foundational, mathematically scientific work. So much so that he's more famous than a lot of these guys to the average person, right? There's also Hippocrates, who would be famous with doctors at least, because doctors still take the Hippocratic Oath. And he really kind of pioneered an idea that you could find a natural cause and a natural treatment for most illnesses, rather than simply thinking it was the humors or spirits or things of kind of a mysterious nature. Of course, when we get sick, it kind of seems to come on us mysteriously, but he had a foundational conviction that it was natural causes, right? And he came up with an oath, which, among many other things, famously says to first do no harm. In other words, if someone comes to you and they're sick, don't make them worse. Don't do something that will harm them, right? And his work, in that sense, in a practical medical way, is very foundational. Right? Now, let's take a look here. We've got all these people and all these places that they came from. And I thought it'd be useful. Let's take a look at the map and see where those are. Right? Now, Democritus came from Thrace. That's here. It's a region, really, in this section of, just beyond Byzantium or Troy, right? That is connected to Greece, right? The island of Lesbos is where, right here, is where Sappho came from. Right? Ephesus, down here, is where Heraclitus came from. The island of Samos, just nearby, is where Pythagoras came from. Now, Miletus produced more than any other place among these Ionian writers, and that is Thales, Anaximenes, Anaximander, Hecataeus. Right? Halicarnassus produced Herodotus, and Hippocrates came from the island of Kos nearby. All these, from Ionia. Once again, from the place where those Mycenaean refugees, not all of them, but many of them, had fled to, and the place where Greeks are most exposed to and interconnected with other people and other cultures. Principally, it's the Persian Empire right here, of course. And by all the shipping traffic coming from this coastline, many other parts of the ancient world. And so where the Greeks are first running into them, it churns up the ideas and the mental creativity to produce so many different areas of new learning and new exploration that we get a lot of the foundations of classical Greece from them in there. All right, guys. Well, that wraps it up for the first section. Look very soon, probably tomorrow, for our next video on the second assignment for reading, and at least one more reading assignment before we break for Easter. I hope you had a good weekend, and I will talk to you soon. See you later, guys.